The morning mist still hugged the fields when the farmer first laid eyes on the draft horse that would change everything. The animal stood apart from the others, a giant coated in dust and dried sweat, muscles tight as if bracing for trouble. Its dark eyes held something restless, something uncertain, as though it carried a long story no one had ever cared to hear. The men at the auction yard kept a cautious distance, whispering about how the horse had been passed from owner to owner, each one calling it too risky, too unpredictable, too much trouble for any farm. Yet the farmer felt something different when he looked at it, something steady in the way it breathed against the cold air. He wiped the mud off his boots, stepped closer, and watched the horse lift its head with slow, measured caution. The animal was huge, tall enough to tower over any wagon, strong enough to pull heavy loads with ease. But power wasn't the problem. The auction talk followed the horse like a shadow. Some said it had run wild during storms. Others claimed it broke through fences and kicked down stalls. A few even whispered that no one could fully understand what made it act the way it did. But the farmer sensed that the truth was simpler. The horse didn't look wild to him. It looked worried, as if waiting for someone to finally see past the stories. When the bidding began, most hands stayed low. A few men raised their eyebrows when the farmer offered the first bid. When he offered the last one, silence fell. He signed the slip with a firm hand, knowing he had just taken a chance that could either break him or save him. The auctioneer shook his head, almost amused, as if the farmer had bought a heap of problems tied to 4 hooves. But the farmer walked toward his new draft horse without hesitation. He placed a hand gently on its neck, feeling the tense muscles beneath the thick coat. The horse flinched, then slowly relaxed, letting out a breath that steamed through the morning chill. Getting the horse home was not simple. It hesitated at the wagon, pulling back from the lead rope, hooves skidding across the dirt. The farmer spoke in a soft tone, easing the horse forward step by step until it finally climbed into the trailer. When they started moving, the horse shifted its weight, steadying itself as though unsure the ground beneath it could be trusted. The farmer kept checking over his shoulder during the ride back, noticing how the horse's eyes watched everything outside the slats, alert to every passing shadow. The farm sat at the edge of wide, open land, surrounded by fields that stretched toward the hills. It had weathered years of storms, drought, and long seasons of hard work. The farmer lived alone, tending to the fields, livestock, and the old barn with its wooden beams that creaked in the wind. Bringing a strong draft horse onto the farm should have meant relief. It should have meant progress, but this horse brought something else. An energy that made the air feel different, heavier, as though the land itself recognized the animal's arrival. When the trailer door opened, the horse stepped out cautiously, sniffing the ground, ears turning toward the quiet creak of the barn door swinging in the breeze. The other animals sensed it immediately. The cattle shifted uneasily in the pasture. The pair of smaller workhorses kept their distance, watching with wide, uncertain eyes. Even the farm dog, usually bold and loud, stayed behind the fence, tail low, sensing a tension that wasn't easy to name. The farmer led the new draft horse to an open stall in the barn. The horse paused at the entrance, staring into the dim space as if seeing something he could not. Then it stepped in with a slow, deliberate movement. The farmer laid out clean hay, set a bucket of fresh water, and placed a hand on the horse's muzzle. The animal accepted the touch with a heavy sigh. But just moments later, a loud crack sounded outside the barn, the wind knocking a loose board against the side wall. The horse jolted so sharply the farmer had to step back to avoid being struck. Its eyes widened, nostrils flaring, hooves scraping the ground. The farmer spoke softly, calming the horse again with steady words. It took time, but the horse settled, though its breathing remained deep and uneven. The farmer had seen troubled animals before, but this one carried a different kind of weight, something tied to old fears the horse had not yet let go of. He closed the stall gate gently, turning back only when he heard the horse shift again, looking at him through the thin bars with an expression that made him pause. It wasn't fear now. It was something closer to a plea. Later that afternoon, the sky darkened with thick clouds rolling low across the horizon. A storm was building, one of those sudden weather changes that turned calm fields into restless shadows. The farmer stepped outside, scanning the sky, knowing he needed to secure the equipment before the rain arrived. Wind brushed through the long grass, making the rows sway like an unsettled tide. The air felt charged, heavy with a tension he couldn't quite explain. From the barn came a sudden thud, followed by a harsh scraping sound. The farmer rushed inside and found the draft horse pacing the stall, pushing its weight against the wooden boards as though trying to escape something unseen. The horse's eyes darted toward the open window where the wind howled softly. The farmer stepped in, placing a hand on the horse's shoulder, feeling the trembling beneath its skin. He murmured calming words, and after a moment the horse stopped pushing against the boards. But it didn't relax entirely. Instead, it turned to the door, pressing its nose against the latch as if trying to warn him of something outside. The storm broke soon after. Rain pounded against the roof, and thunder rolled across the land. The farmer moved quickly, securing tools, checking fences, making sure everything held firm against the wind. But even through the rumble of the storm, he could hear the draft horse's deep calls from the barn, filled with unease. It wasn't just fear of thunder. It was something sharper, something more aware. The horse was reacting to something else. When the rain eased into a steady drizzle, the farmer walked back into the barn with a lantern. The draft horse stood alert, ears forward, breathing slow and heavy. The wind blew through the cracks in the barn wall, carrying the scent of wet soil and something faintly off. Something that made the farmer tense without knowing why. The horse caught the scent too, lifting its head sharply, muscles tightening again. The farmer raised the lantern toward the barn entrance, trying to see into the darkness beyond. The light flickered as the wind pushed through the door. The draft horse stepped closer to him, positioning itself slightly ahead, almost protective in its stance. The farmer felt a strange shift in his chest. Something outside had the horse on edge. Something the animal had sensed long before the farmer ever noticed. A faint sound drifted through the rain, distant but real. It wasn't thunder, not wind, not an animal he recognized. It came again, low and dragging, like someone moving through wet brush at the edge of the property. The draft horse let out a deep, warning rumble. The farmer held the lantern steady, waiting, listening. The rain eased into a light patter on the roof. The barn felt too quiet, the air too still. The horse didn't look fearful now. It looked ready, focused, watching the dark doorway as if expecting something to step out at any moment. The farmer swallowed, heart beating harder, sensing the same tension the horse felt. The sound outside came again, closer this time, making the lantern flame tremble. The draft horse took a single, firm step forward, its powerful body bracing as though preparing to face whatever approached. And in that moment, with the storm dying and the shadows gathering around the barn, the farmer realized the chance he took on this risky horse was about to collide with something far bigger than he had expected. Something was moving on the land, heading toward the farm, and the horse seemed to know exactly what it was. Rain clung to the barn roof in tiny beads, sliding down the old boards and dripping into the muddy ground below. The draft horse kept its body angled between the farmer and the barn door as though it had taken on a duty the moment that strange sound reached their ears. The farmer stood still, lantern held high, waiting for another sign of movement outside. But the noise faded into the distant patter of rain and the soft rumble of clouds moving off into the hills. The tension hung in the air like the last echo of a storm that refused to leave. The farmer didn't step outside. Not yet. He trusted his instincts, and they told him to wait. More importantly, he trusted the horse's instincts, and the animal was not ready to let him venture into the dark. The horse's breathing remained firm and steady, but its muscles stayed tight beneath the thick coat. When the farmer finally lowered the lantern, the horse relaxed only a little, lowering its head but keeping one ear toward the open doorway. The farmer set the lantern on a crate and leaned against the stall gate, taking a slow breath. He studied the horse in the warm glow. Its massive frame cast a long shadow across the hay-covered floor. The faint smell of wet soil drifted in, mixing with the familiar scent of the barn. He knew he had bought a risky draft horse, but at that moment he saw something more than a troubled animal. He saw a creature that understood danger long before any human could. Something in its past had carved that awareness deep into its instincts. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the horse's neck. The animal did not shy away. Instead, it let its eyes soften, lowering its head slightly as though grateful for a quiet moment away from the storm. The farmer brushed his fingers along the tangled mane, wondering where the horse had come from and what kind of life it had lived before crossing his path at the auction yard. People often sold animals when they grew tired of dealing with their problems, but this horse didn't feel like a problem. It felt like a survivor. The farmer left the lantern burning as he walked to the other end of the barn to check the coats of his two smaller workhorses. They had calmed, but still glanced repeatedly toward the stall of the new arrival. They sensed the shift just as strongly. Animals always did. The dog trotted to the barn doorway and sat with its ears perked forward, silent but watchful. Once the storm passed entirely, the farmer closed the barn doors and gave the draft horse one last look before heading toward his cabin for the night. The horse followed his movements until he stepped out of sight, then settled into the straw with a heavy, tired breath. It seemed to know the farm was now its place, though not yet its peace. Morning came with quiet sunlight cutting through the clouds and laying soft stripes across the fields. The storm had washed everything clean. The ground glistened with fresh rainwater, and the air smelled of grass and the faint sweetness of damp earth. The farmer walked back to the barn with a bucket in hand, but not before studying the far edge of the property. No tracks stood out clearly in the wet soil, but something about the way the brush near the boundary line was bent and disturbed made him uneasy. It wasn't enough to name, but enough to keep him thinking. When he entered the barn, the draft horse lifted its head immediately, alert but calm. The farmer set the bucket down, offered a quick pat on the neck, and placed a feed bag near the stall gate. The horse ate quietly, pausing now and then to glance outside. As the day stretched forward, the farmer got to work on the fields. The storm had softened the soil, making it easier to plow. He harnessed one of the smaller workhorses first, guiding it through the rows. The land was familiar to him, every rise and dip known by memory. But each time he paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead, his eyes drifted toward the barn, where the draft horse stood in the doorway, watching him as though trying to understand all of his movements. After a while, he returned to the barn and decided it was time to test the new horse's ability to pull. He fitted the harness slowly, letting the draft horse feel the straps and leather against its coat. The animal tensed, not from fear, but from a kind of readiness. When the farmer led it toward the field, the horse matched his pace step for step, lowering its head when the plow was hooked behind. He gave a gentle command, and the draft horse pulled. The soil broke in clean, deep lines. The farmer nodded with satisfaction. The strength he expected was there, but what impressed him most was the horse's focus. No sudden jerks, no wild behavior, no panic. Just steady, powerful work. It was a rare thing to see, especially from an animal with such a complicated reputation. But every so often the horse paused, lifting its head toward the distant tree line, staring with that same tension from the night before. Its ears flicked back, then forward again, and its hooves pressed firmly into the turned soil. Something beyond the fields still unsettled it. That evening, after the day's work ended, the farmer sat on the bench outside the barn and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The draft horse stood inside the barn doorway again, as though refusing to rest until the last light faded. The farmer spoke softly, mostly to himself, but the horse listened with calm patience. He talked about the tight seasons the farm had seen, the years when crops struggled, the years when livestock fell ill, and the long stretch of time he had managed everything alone. He hadn't expected to buy another horse so soon, much less one that came with warnings from every corner of the auction yard. But something told him this animal belonged here, no matter what trouble might come with it. The days that followed grew warmer. Sunlight returned to the fields, and the farm found its rhythm again. The draft horse settled into its work with surprising ease. It learned the routines, understood the commands, and even grew comfortable with the other animals. But no matter how calm it seemed during the day, it always became alert at night. Every dusk, the horse stood near the barn entrance, ears turning toward the outer edges of the property. It paced sometimes, slow and steady, stopping to sniff the wind or stare across the pasture. The farmer noticed the pattern and started checking the boundary lines more carefully. He found broken branches along the fence one afternoon. On another day, he discovered the ground near the creek bed pressed down by something heavy. It wasn't livestock, and it wasn't the dog. Whatever had passed through the land moved with weight and purpose. The farmer didn't jump to conclusions. Trouble came and went over the years in many shapes. But the draft horse's constant unease made him think the threat was real, and not just the horse's old memories haunting it. The animal was trying to say something with its posture, its watchfulness, its refusal to fully rest when the world grew dark. One night, the farmer woke to the sound of the draft horse striking the stall boards. Not violently, but firmly enough to wake him. He grabbed his boots and lantern again, heading to the barn with a feeling that reached deeper than fear. The horse stood tall, eyes fixed on the far wall as though seeing through it. The wind outside was quiet. Too quiet. When the farmer opened the barn doors, the horse shifted to his side, standing close, breathing hard. The lantern's glow barely reached past the doorway, but even in the dim light he could see the grass moving in an unnatural line near the fence. Something was there, moving low to the ground, making its way deeper onto the property. He didn't step out. Neither did the horse. They both stood still, watching, waiting, wondering. The movement stopped. The line in the grass flattened. A silence followed that felt heavier than the night air. The farmer slowly closed the barn doors. The draft horse backed away only when the latch clicked into place, but even then its eyes stayed fixed on that same patch of darkness. The farmer rested a hand on its shoulder, feeling the tension that ran through the animal like a tight rope. Whatever was out there was not gone. And whatever it was, the draft horse wasn't afraid of it. It was preparing. The next morning began with an unusual calm, the kind that felt more like a warning than a blessing. The air in the town carried a quiet heaviness, as if the streets themselves were watching and waiting. Mara noticed it the moment she stepped outside. Every small sound felt sharper than usual. A passing car, a door closing somewhere down the road, even the distant hum of a power line felt strangely intense. She tried to shake it off as leftover stress from the night before, but the feeling stayed with her like a shadow. She made her way to the small cafe near the corner where she and Daniel always met before work. The place had been a familiar comfort for years, but today something about it felt different. The lights inside flickered for a second, barely noticeable but enough to make her stop for a breath before pushing the door open. Daniel was already sitting by the window, looking as if he had been awake all night. He had a habit of tapping his fingers when he was nervous, and his hand was moving nonstop across the table. She sat down without a word, sensing that whatever he had discovered since their last conversation was not something small. He looked at her with a tight expression, the kind that said he was holding more inside than he wanted to admit. He took a slow breath and lowered his voice. He said he had dug deeper into the file they found earlier and realized it connected to something much bigger than they expected. He mentioned names they had never heard before, strangers who seemed to have nothing to do with their lives. Yet every detail pointed in their direction in a way that made no sense at all. Mara listened, feeling her worry grow with each new detail. Nothing about this situation felt accidental. The strange messages they had received, the missing documents, the unusual activity in the town, everything was beginning to line up in a way that suggested someone had planned this long before they ever noticed anything was wrong. She tried to stay calm, reminding herself that panic would only cloud their judgment, but it was becoming harder to hide the knot tightening in her chest. Daniel paused, glancing around the cafe. He leaned closer and explained that the connection between all the information came down to a single location on the outskirts of town. It was an old research building that had been abandoned years ago but still showed signs of occasional use. That detail alone made Mara uneasy. She remembered passing that building many times, always feeling like it carried some hidden weight. She had never questioned it before, but now it seemed like the center of something they were never meant to uncover. They agreed to avoid rash decisions. Instead, they spent the afternoon gathering whatever information they could without drawing attention. Mara reached out to people she trusted, but even those conversations felt strange. Some friends spoke with hesitation. Others avoided giving clear answers. A few did not respond at all. It felt as if the whole town was choosing silence, as if everyone knew something but refused to acknowledge it openly. By evening the tension had grown so thick that Mara could feel it with every breath. The sky turned a darker shade than usual, and the wind carried a dull chill even though the season was warm. Daniel sent a message saying he wanted to check something at the community library, a place known for keeping old public records. She met him there, only to find him standing near the back shelves with a stack of files that looked decades old. He said the records contained gaps, entire months missing, documents removed or replaced, names blacked out. It was clear that someone had intentionally erased parts of the town's past. Mara flipped through one of the files and noticed a small symbol written in the corner of a page. It was faint, almost invisible. Daniel told her the same symbol appeared in several files, all connected to that abandoned building on the outskirts. The repetition of that symbol made her feel cold. It meant whatever was happening had been happening for a long time. Not weeks, not months, but possibly years. And for some reason she and Daniel were now tangled in it. While searching through the files, the lights flickered again, brighter than the cafe incident. A low hum rolled through the room. It was steady but uncomfortable, as if the sound was coming from somewhere beneath the floor. Mara and Daniel locked eyes, both realizing that this was not just an electrical issue. Something in the building shifted, faint but noticeable. They backed away from the shelf and waited until the hum faded. The librarian approached them with a cautious expression. She whispered that they should not stay too long. She did not explain why. She did not ask what they were looking for. Her tone alone made it clear that she knew more than she could say. Mara thanked her and stepped outside with Daniel, both feeling the weight of a warning that carried no explanation. They walked toward the main square, trying to piece together everything they had seen. The night felt strangely quiet, as if even the usual sounds of the town had been muted. Daniel mentioned that he had been thinking about something he had not told her earlier. He said he had received a message the night before from an unknown number. The message contained only a short phrase, nothing threatening but strange enough to unsettle him. It said he was getting close, no details, no names, no context. Just those words. Mara felt her stomach tighten. It meant someone was watching them. Someone knew the moment they began uncovering the truth. She tried to stay logical, reminding herself that they had no proof of danger. Still, there was no denying the sense of being followed. She checked behind them more than once as they walked, but the street looked empty. The stillness felt unnatural. They decided to split up for the night to avoid drawing attention. Daniel would return to his apartment to study the remaining files, while Mara would go home and check her own notes. They promised to stay in touch and meet early in the morning. Mara walked home with long, steady steps, trying to keep her breathing even. She kept her phone in her hand, ready to call him if anything felt wrong. Inside her house, she locked every door and sat at her desk with her notebook open. She wrote down everything they had found. She highlighted the symbol from the files, the gaps in the records, the abandoned building, the strange message Daniel received. She wrote until the page was full, hoping that seeing everything in one place would make the situation clearer. Instead, it made the mystery even darker. Her room felt colder than usual. She checked the vents and the windows but found nothing unusual. The feeling of being watched returned. She tried to ignore it and continued reviewing her notes. Halfway through, her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel, only 2 words. He said he found something. The tone of the message was enough to send a wave of unease through her. She called him immediately, but he did not answer. She tried again. Nothing. She paced her room, trying not to jump to conclusions. She reminded herself that his signal sometimes dropped in his building, but tonight that explanation felt thin. She sent him a message asking if he was safe. No reply. She stood at her window, looking toward the direction of his apartment. The night sky was dark, the kind that swallowed every bit of light. The street outside was still and quiet. She felt torn between staying inside where it was safe and going out to check on him. Her instincts urged caution, but her worry for him grew by the second. She stepped away from the window and took a breath. Whatever was happening had already pulled them in deeper than they expected, and now the unknown was closing in even more. The conflict had reached a point where every step felt like walking into shadows. Yet she knew one thing with complete certainty. She and Daniel were not imagining this. Something real was happening in their town, something hidden beneath years of silence, and now it was beginning to surface. She sat down again, trying to calm herself. She needed to think clearly. She needed to plan. The night stretched ahead with a heavy question hanging over her. What did Daniel find? The answer was out there, waiting. And whatever it was, it would change everything. Mara stepped out of her room with her phone still in her hand, her heartbeat louder than the quiet house around her. The message from Daniel kept replaying in her mind. He said he found something, and then complete silence. It felt wrong in every way, especially after everything they had uncovered. She grabbed her jacket and left the house, locking the door behind her with unsteady fingers. The night outside had a strange weight to it, as if the air had thickened with tension. The streets were empty as she walked toward his apartment. The usual noise from nearby houses was missing. Even the dogs that usually barked at passing footsteps were silent. She felt watched again, more strongly than before. Every streetlight she passed flickered for a brief moment, creating brief shadows that shifted quickly. She pressed on, refusing to let fear slow her down. When she reached Daniel's building, she noticed something unusual. The lobby lights were off, and the air inside felt cold. She pushed the door open and stepped into the dim hallway. Her footsteps echoed more than they should have. She called out his name quietly, not wanting to draw attention but unable to stand the silence. No answer came back. She made her way to his apartment on the 3rd floor. His door was closed, but she noticed a faint line of light coming from underneath it. She knocked softly, no response. She hesitated for a few seconds, then turned the handle. To her surprise, the door opened without resistance. Daniel always locked his door, always. The fact that it was unlocked sent a cold shiver down her spine. Inside, the apartment looked normal at first, but then she noticed the stack of papers scattered across the floor near his desk. His laptop was open, the screen glowing faintly. She stepped inside and called his name again, still no response. The silence was thick and heavy. She looked around for any sign of him, but the apartment was empty. She walked to the desk and saw a file open on the screen. It showed a map of the town with certain areas marked in a darker tone. One of the marked locations was the abandoned research building on the outskirts. She leaned closer and noticed additional notes next to it. Daniel had written that the building had more rooms underground, far more than anyone knew existed. He had highlighted a point labeled restricted lower level. She felt her pulse rise. She checked the papers on the floor and saw photocopies of old records, each one connected to the building. One page had the same symbol from the library files. Daniel had circled it and drawn an arrow pointing to a short sentence beneath. The sentence said this level remained sealed since the first closure. The language felt cold and official, but something about it suggested secrecy rather than safety. She looked around the room again, searching for any clue about where he had gone. Then she noticed something on the floor near the doorway. It was his keychain. He never left it behind. The realization tightened her chest. Something happened here. Something sudden? She picked up the keychain and stood still for a moment, trying to steady her thoughts. She checked her phone again. Still no reply from him. She tapped the screen, hoping for even a single message. Nothing. She knew she could not stay there. If someone had taken him or followed him, she needed to move quickly. She gathered the papers and stuffed them into her bag, making sure not to leave anything behind. On her way out, she paused in the doorway. The air felt colder than before, as if the room itself held an unsettling memory of whatever had happened. She closed the door quietly and hurried down the stairs. Outside, the night felt even heavier. She could sense the urgency in every breath she took. She made her way toward the outskirts of town, guided by the map Daniel had been studying. The path was long and quiet, and the deeper she went, the more distant the town lights became. The wind blew colder, brushing against her face with an uneasy chill. She kept her steps steady, reminding herself that she needed to stay focused. She did not know what she would find, but turning back was no longer an option. When she reached the old research building, she stopped several feet away and studied it from a distance. The structure stood dark against the night sky. The windows were boarded and the walls were worn with age. She could almost feel the history that clung to it, a history buried under layers of silence and secrecy. She walked closer and saw light flickering inside through tiny cracks in the boards, her breath caught. Someone was in there. She approached the side door, the one that had always been chained shut. Tonight the chain was hanging loose. The padlock was missing. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped into the stale air inside. Dust floated through the thin beam of her phone light. The place smelled old and forgotten, yet she could sense movement deeper inside. She followed the faint light coming from the corridor ahead. Every step echoed softly. She reached the main hallway and paused when she saw footprints in the dust, fresh ones. More than one pair. Her heart pounded as she followed them toward the stairs that led underground. The air grew colder as she descended, and she felt a growing pressure in her chest as if the space below carried something long hidden. At the bottom of the stairs, she reached a metal door that stood slightly open. A pale light seeped through the gap. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The room beyond looked nothing like the decaying building above. The walls were smooth. The lighting was modern. Machines hummed quietly, their faint vibrations spreading through the floor. She stared in shock. The place was not abandoned at all. She walked carefully, trying to stay quiet. The air felt dense, almost charged. She could feel the tension in the room like a static current against her skin. She checked the papers in her bag again. One of the records mentioned a hidden continuation of the original research, work that had never been disclosed to the public. Whatever they tried to cover up was still happening here. She heard a sound from a nearby hallway. A soft metallic noise, like something being moved. She froze. Then she heard a voice, faint, muffled. She could not make out the words, but the tone matched Daniel's voice. Relief and fear surged through her at the same time. She moved toward the sound, her steps light but quick. The hallway led to another room with a sliding door. She stood beside it and listened. Daniel's voice came again, clearer this time. He sounded tense but unharmed. She reached for the door, only to stop when she heard another voice. Someone else was in there with him. The person spoke calmly, almost too calmly, as if they were explaining something rather than threatening him. Mara pressed her ear to the door. The stranger said that Daniel had uncovered too much and that the information he found connected to a past event buried under strict security. He told Daniel that the restricted lower level was not meant to be accessed by anyone outside their circle. His tone carried hints of authority, something official yet hidden. Mara felt anger rising inside her. She could hear Daniel questioning him, demanding answers. The stranger interrupted him and mentioned the symbol found on the old files. He said it represented an ongoing operation, a project that had been active for years, silently shaping certain outcomes in the town. His voice softened for a moment as he warned Daniel that continued digging would only put him in deeper risk. Before Mara could decide what to do next, she heard footsteps approaching from another hallway behind her. She quickly slipped behind a large metal cabinet, holding her breath. Two people walked past her hiding spot, discussing something in low voices. They mentioned a scheduled transfer and the need to prepare the lower level. Their tone suggested urgency and secrecy, as if something important was about to happen. Mara stayed still until their voices faded. She returned her attention to the sliding door and tightened her grip on her phone. She needed to get Daniel out, but charging in blindly would make things worse. She needed to understand what was happening first. She needed to know what they were planning. Looking around, she noticed a small control panel beside the door. It had a series of buttons and a screen showing her activity. She watched the signals on the screen and saw multiple figures moving in the lower levels. The number of people down there was higher than she expected. Whatever operation they were running was active tonight. A sudden alarm went off deeper in the building. It was not loud, but sharp enough to signal a shift in urgency. Lights flickered briefly overhead. Mara pressed herself against the cabinet again and listened. Voices grew louder. Someone said they detected unauthorized movement in the building. Another person responded with instructions to check every hallway. Her chest tightened. They were searching for her. She looked back at the sliding door and made a choice. If they found her, everything would fall apart. She needed to move fast. She reached for the panel and looked for anything that could unlock the door from the outside. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she tried to interpret the labels. Then she saw it, a manual override button tucked in the corner. She pressed it. The door clicked. The sound echoed slightly in the quiet hallway. She stepped back quickly, ready to duck into the shadows again. Inside the room, she heard Daniel react in surprise. The stranger's voice rose, sharper now. The tension inside the building thickened instantly, as if the entire underground facility had shifted into a higher state of alert. She stood there for a moment, heart pounding, waiting for the door to slide open. Every second felt stretched thin with suspense. The alarm continued in the distance, echoing through the underground halls. She could hear running footsteps, getting closer. Someone shouted instructions from far down the corridor. The entire place was coming alive with activity. The door began to move, and Mara knew the moment ahead would change everything. The door slid open just enough for Mara to slip inside, and she moved quickly before anyone in the hallway could catch sight of her. Daniel stood near a table, his hands raised slightly in surprise when he saw her. His eyes widened with a mix of relief and fear. Across from him stood the man who had been questioning him, dressed in plain clothing but carrying an air of authority that made it clear he had some official role in everything that had unfolded. The man turned toward her, startled but not completely caught off guard. He took a step back and lifted his hands, showing he had no weapon. His eyes were sharp, and for a moment Mara could see a strange mix of frustration and calm acceptance in them. It was as if he had expected someone to interfere eventually, just not this soon. She moved closer to Daniel, keeping her body angled between him and the stranger. Daniel whispered to her that he was not harmed. He said they had been talking about the research building, about how it had never stopped operating. The stranger sighed and explained that there had been an old environmental operation hidden beneath the public closure, something meant to track soil changes and measure water sources in nearby farmland. It was supposed to protect surrounding farms from harmful runoff, but years of secrecy had created confusion, suspicion, and rumors. They hid the operation because they believed too much public attention would disrupt their work. He admitted they had made mistakes in communication, but insisted the operation was not harmful. Mara listened carefully, trying to judge the truth behind his words. She looked at Daniel, who gave a small nod. He believed the man to some extent, but both of them knew something still felt wrong. Before she could ask questions, the alarm sounded again. The stranger looked uneasy and said other workers were on their way. He urged them to follow him to a safer exit before things escalated. Mara hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. But Daniel touched her arm gently and said they had no choice right now. They followed him down a long hallway that sloped upward. As they moved, the stranger admitted that they had been tracking unusual shifts beneath the farmland. He said the lower levels were built to monitor underground changes and prevent disasters. When Daniel found the files and notes, he unknowingly stepped into research that was still active. The organization feared the data falling into the wrong hands, since certain companies had tried to force their way into the operation years back. That was why they had reacted so strongly when they realized the files were accessed. Mara asked why he had confronted Daniel alone instead of contacting authorities. The stranger paused, then answered that the organization had grown used to isolation. They were trained to protect secrets first and explain later, even when it caused more distrust. He admitted it created trouble for everyone involved. His voice softened when he said he wished their group had handled things differently. It was the closest thing to an apology he could offer while still standing in the middle of his operation. They reached a narrower passage and the alarm faded behind them. The stranger said the exit was ahead, but he stopped walking and turned to face them. He told them the main danger was not the research center itself, but the growing instability underground. Something had shifted below the farmland, something they had been trying to measure for weeks. The changes were unpredictable, and the data pointed to a possible collapse under certain areas. If that happened, farms across the region would be at risk. Mara and Daniel exchanged a look of concern. The stranger insisted that what they had been doing was for the protection of the land and the people living on it. That was why they had added security, why they kept layers of secrecy, why they feared the files being misread. He gave them the chance to leave and forget everything, but his voice hinted at a deeper request. He hoped they would understand the reasons behind the operation. Before they could respond, a loud rumble shook the hallway. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The stranger raised his hands in alarm and urged them to move faster. They rushed toward the exit door at the end of the corridor. When they stepped outside, the cool night air washed over them. The door shut behind them automatically. For a moment, they stood still, catching their breath and trying to absorb everything. Mara looked at Daniel. He looked worn but steady, as if the weight of everything had settled on him all at once. He said they needed to report what they had learned, even if the truth was complicated. He also said the farmland owners deserved to know the risks underground, even if it meant facing backlash from the organization. She agreed, feeling that the only way forward was through openness rather than secrecy. They walked back toward town with slow steps, each of them thinking about the strange night they had just survived. By the time they reached Daniel's apartment, the sky was growing lighter. A soft early glow touched the rooftops, reminding them that life outside the research tunnels continued in a steady rhythm. Inside the apartment they sat together, sorting the papers Mara had taken. Many of them confirmed what the stranger had said. Others raised questions that would need careful answers. As the day brightened, they began planning how to present the information in a responsible way. Daniel said they should meet with the local council and show them the documents. He believed the organization could be pressured into opening a public discussion if their findings were handled calmly. Mara agreed and said the key was avoiding fear and focusing on the facts. They were both tired, but a sense of purpose had settled in. Over the next days they gathered evidence, spoke to a few trusted people, and prepared their explanation. When they finally met with the council, the room was quiet as they described the underground shifts and the ongoing operation. Some council members reacted with surprise, others with concern, but no one dismissed their claims. The council asked to speak with the organization directly, and soon the two sides sat across from each other. The stranger from the underground facility attended the meeting. This time he spoke openly, answering questions instead of deflecting them. He admitted the mistakes in communication and secrecy. He emphasized the purpose behind their operation, describing how they monitored soil quality and protected nearby farms from potential structural damage. He shared evidence that supported his words. It took time, but the council agreed to create a cooperative plan. The underground organization would continue its work, but with oversight, transparency, and scheduled public updates. The farmland owners were informed of the underground risks and given guidance on safety measures. For the first time in years, the town felt included rather than kept in the dark. Mara and Daniel felt a quiet relief as the tension finally eased. The truth, complicated as it was, had brought people together instead of pushing them apart. The farms remained safe, and the soil monitoring continued with shared responsibility. Later, as they stood near the edge of the fields at sunset, Daniel looked across the land and said he never imagined a simple discovery would lead them into something so tangled. Mara smiled softly and said sometimes the truth comes in layers and what matters is how people choose to handle it. The warm colors of the sky reflected across the open fields, carrying a feeling of calm that had been missing for weeks. The underground rooms were still active beneath them, but now they carried no mystery and no fear. They had become part of the town's shared knowledge, something protected by community understanding rather than hidden behind locked doors. Mara felt grateful for that change. She felt grateful they had stepped into the unknown and come out with something meaningful. As they walked back toward the road, Daniel thanked her for showing up that night, for facing the danger without hesitation. She told him she simply followed her instincts and that she would do it again. They shared a quiet moment, grateful for safety, honesty, and the sense that things were finally settling into place. The farmland stretched wide and peaceful, carrying the promise of better days. The tension, once thick and heavy, had lifted. The truth was out, the danger had eased, and the land stood protected. Mara felt a sense of closure as they continued walking, the fields glowing under the last light of the day. The story that had begun with fear ended with trust, clarity, and the quiet comfort of hope.